Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for those online as well. We're happy to be able to run today as a hybrid event. So I'm Justin Hollander, and I'm a professor here at Tufts in the Department of Urban Environmental Policy and Planning. So this is the Cities at Tufts Colloquium, and we have partners, Shareable, the Crestview Foundation, the Barr Foundation, and Professor Julian Adjaman, who is joining us online today, together with his research assistants, Caitlin McClellan and Deandra Boyle. They organize Cities at Tufts. It's a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognizes Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning, and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonized Wampanoag and Massachusetts traditional territory. And today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Erin Graves. Erin is a visiting scholar here at UEP at Tufts, and she is also a senior policy analyst and advisor at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. She conducts research on housing and other policies that combat and disadvantage. Erin has a doctorate in urban planning and sociology from MIT and a master's in planning from the University of Illinois, Chicago. So I've known Erin for many years, and she and I have collaborated on a bunch of research projects. So it was really just so wonderful for me that we were able to get her to be a visiting scholar here this year. And I'm really excited to hear about what she wants to talk about at what she's going to talk about today at the session. So we're going to give her about a half an hour to tell her story, and then really the rest of our hour together is for Q&A and discussion. I do want to let everyone know that the next session of the Cities at Tufts Colloquium is on February 8th. Dr. Andrea Roberts, Associate Professor of Urban Environmental Planning at the University of Virginia School of Architecture, is going to be joining us remotely. So hopefully you can join us for that. So, Erin.
That one. So thank you, Justin, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you for the many people who were involved in putting this together. Julian, the folks at Shareable, there were just a lot of folks on these emails as we're trying to put this together. So I'm very grateful for all of their labor in putting this together. As Justin said, I'm Erin Graves. I'm super excited to be talking to you today about this project. I'm going to talk fast because I somehow decided a little more than a half an hour, and I might ask Justin after he gets his snacks to just be my timekeeper if he would be so kind. Okay. Great. So, okay, I cannot advance. Oh, wait, maybe this is why. I can't advance these slides. Oh, there you go. Now, what did you do? I clicked on it. You just be my friend and click. Okay. Just for thank you so much. Okay, so as we'll get through this quickly, everything Justin said and a little bit less. Wait, Deanna, you're being my crutch. And this picture I just chose because my wonderful colleague took it, and some of these hands are mine, but this is a picture from the folks in community development in my department at the Boston Fed. Oh, then I need to animate. There we go. Got it. And first, two disclaimers. One, this is a work in progress. I'm here. I'm so delighted to be here as a visiting scholar to work on this project. So I'm making headway on the project. We're going to talk about that. Super wonderful. Super great to hear any questions or comments you have, because at this stage, we're still at the formative stage. But much more importantly, I really need to disclaim from my institution that these ideas are my own and they do not represent the Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve Board. So I do a lot of introductory research thinking about how to introduce this problem. And it seems like any article I pick up from any era, we're in a housing crisis. And so I want to talk about different housing crises and how they're framed and how the contemporary one might differ. So in the earliest 20th century, as America urbanized and folks realized that we needed much more places for people to stay than we had available, we had the tenants. The problem there was overcrowding and the unsafe and unsanitary conditions that were a result of that. And most moral actors in the system disavowed unsafe, unsanitary, and deadly conditions. And we had policies to eradicate those types of conditions. Then the mid 20th century, these are extremely familiar maps. Who knows what this map is of? In Chicago, very specific. Yes, redlining. That was a discriminatory practice where folks of color and in certain neighborhoods were not able to lend both for home ownership and for business purposes, which was devastating to those neighborhoods. But once again, most moral actors, at least publicly, really disavow discrimination and say it It doesn't have a place in the contemporary market. And again, there are lots of policies to try to combat that, not that effective as we know. And then the following crisis in the 21st century, we had the foreclosure crisis. The problem here, among other problems, was predatory lending, being really targeting certain households for loans with unfavorable terms under conditions they really could not handle. And once again, we have policy actors saying this isn't okay. We have the Dodd-Frank Act to try to control this behavior. Oh, the camera's moving. Yes. Okay. And now this crisis, and I'm calling this the mid-21st century. I'm a little eager on that one, but I wasn't sure how to label it. And this, this is the crisis of affordability. And many people attribute this crisis of affordability to a twinfold problem. The twinfold problem is that we have property rights. So property is a commodity that people can buy and sell on the market. It is folks' nest egg. It is their source of wealth on the individual level, on the corporate level. The housing sector is an enormous sector of the economy. And so property rights and the buying and selling of property is something that is part of the system in a way many people endorse. And the second source of our affordability problem, many people say, is zoning. As we know, single family zoning doesn't enable the kind of density that we need both to keep people in cities as well as keep costs down. I'll keep advancing my slides. Unlike these other crises, this crisis unfortunately aligns with our value system. As I've sort of alluded to here, we are okay with private property, and zoning is highly contentious. Many people prize their single family homes with lots of acronyms to describe those folks in that behavior. Oh, but now I have a really good picture. Okay, so more about this housing crisis, and hopefully we'll get my great picture off in a second. It's monthly based, as I said. But I also want to say that from a market perspective, that the way that the housing market works today, if we say it's part of capitalism, which is a popular thing to say, it's actually preys on the, and the affordability aspect actually preys on the lowest form of capitalism. So capitalism worked for a market institution, very fond of capitalism. Capitalism works along three dimensions in order to create growth. It creates growth through efficiency. So making things cheaper, faster, and better is a way it makes growth. It makes growth through innovation, making things that are better than the thing before. I like to use the telephone. 100 years ago, what was the telephone? Look at it now. This is innovation and this is efficiency, and that's how we get these terrible devices that we're glued to. Unfortunately, housing, the main way that housing works in the market today is through scarcity, through supply and demand, that there's more demand than there is supply because the supply is controlled. And even card-carrying capitalists don't like this. They don't think this is the right way to get growth. And certainly there's plenty of capitalists, builders, who would vastly prefer to get more efficiency by eradicating zoning. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, it's a problem of capitalism. It's a problem of a particular kind of constraint we put around housing and capitalism. If you saw this photo, you would see an old-timey photo of a person putting up a building for sale. It says, for sale, Baslow sells the earth. This building for sale, for rent, in whole or part. This person is absolutely desperate to be a part of the economy of buying and selling property. But I want to just highlight this phrase they use, sells the earth. So we have this 6 billion-year-old planet we live on. And we've just decided right now to parcel it out to the highest bidder for whoever happens to be occupying it now. And they can have that in perpetuity. So it seems a little strange to me that we've taken this planet, we've heard the land acknowledgement. There's the photo. And here we parceled it out for profit. Let's talk about some alternatives. So an alternative is to decommodify housing. What do I mean by that? What are the types? Typically, there's several types of decommodified housing. That's where there's some divorce between the ability to make money off of property and the right to live there. There are community land trusts. The land is owned by the community. What's on top is negotiable. The structures on top are negotiable. Limited equity cooperatives. These are cooperatives where costs are constrained in order to promote affordability. And shared equity ownership is a huge variety of schemes that enables lots of people to participate in the purchase and therefore keeping the costs lower. So affordability is maintained through shared ownership across the community, across many actors, and through cost constraints. Almost all these models you can buy into it, but when you buy out of it, you are really limited in how much money you can make off of it. And that's to pass that affordability on to the next household. Okay, theory for alternative housing, another quiz. How many housing units do you think there are in the United States? 80 million from Professor Hollander. Anyone else?
120 million.
What's that?
120 million.
Much closer, sir. Yeah, it's about 140 million housing units in the United States. And these alternative housing units I'm talking about, I think saying there's 500,000 is a stretch. So in terms of how common these are, they're not common, but I think that's actually a case to talk about how interesting it is that they endure despite how unusual they are. There's also, given their relative, infrequency, there's a lot written about. Oh, you're trying to get rid of that? Mm-hmm. There's a lot written about alternative housing. Cool. So there's the typical frames are, what does this do for living in an alternative housing environment? What does that do for individual development? Is that household able to thrive and do well in terms of their household's financial stability or social stability? It's also very curious to scholars what happens with civic development. Do these alternative housing programs and environments create the right setting for people to become more politically active, engaged citizens? And then the community development question, what do these alternative housing schemes, how do they fit in with the rest of the community? And the main question there is, do they detract from value by creating some sort of alternative way in the real estate market? I'm taking an alternative feminist frame. This is bell hooks in case you needed a refresh. And the feminist frame, it asks, to what degree do these alternative housing schemes confront inequality, injustice, and oppression? So are these vehicles to work against some of the factors that hold people back in the United States as well as the rest of the world? Primer on feminism. Feminism is a movement to end discriminatory attitudes or beliefs, exploitation, and oppression by Ms. Hooks. It's not about men. It's not about vilifying men or marginalizing men. It is about promoting equality, choice, diversity, and inclusion for all. I will add that, especially globally, disproportionately, most property is owned by men. Okay, on to feminist theory. So feminism is a social movement. It also has a theoretical arm. And the feminist theory investigates, again, and this is my question about housing, how people interact with systems and empower them to confront and eradicate oppressive systems and structures and possibly offer solutions. I'm taking a page from Feminist Economic Geography. I don't think Penn Lowe is here, but thank you to Penn for really helping me key into Catherine Gibson, a feminist economic geographer. And as I went into this sort of disquisition about capitalism, she makes the point with her co-author, Graham, that we treat capitalism as monolithic. We say it's this force that there's nothing we can do, it consumes everything and ruins everything. But in that narrative, we actually give it more power than maybe it necessarily has without that narrative. And that there are non-capitalist sites within capitalism. And it's important to pay attention to those to really cleave apart this, this narrative that capitalism is totalizing. Example that she uses outside of housing that I find really compelling is around sole entrepreneurship and sole proprietorship. So we in the US, we really prize entrepreneurs, we really prize small businesses. Those people own their means of production. They're not yet capitalists. They really wish they were, but we do have a place for them in highly mainstream understanding about the economy. We're interested in alternatives to mainstream housing that are here and now, that are practiced in this environment. I think there's one more. And I've said a lot about theory, but now I'm going to disclaim a little bit. And feminism tries to use low theory. That's not high theory that is only accessible and known by experts, but theory that's developed on the ground and relatable to the people who are experiencing the phenomena. So it seeks to privilege subjugated knowledges. It replaces mastery and favors conversation. And its ultimate goal is to reveal and relieve oppression. And there's sometimes nothing more oppressive than high theory. I'm going to pause since I said this. We introduce thoughts and we introduce discussion. Does anybody have any thoughts before I do the second half of the talk? Yes.
So you said that, and I know it was kind of hyperbole.
Yeah.
You were saying that throughout almost all of the articles in this book that I think you found, the housing crisis is always or the housing market has kind of always been in a crisis. can an argument be made that that's just kind of like its natural state, that it's just about like the housing market is just a volatile market by itself?
Right. I thought of that and I haven't quite settled on that. How's that? Right. Is it that it's volatile? Is it hyperbole in writing? Right? Is it, well, I'm really going to grab the reader if I claim it's crisis, but I haven't really thought very carefully on what I mean by crisis and how is this really different than yesterday, but it feels really extreme. So what do you think?
I'm leaning towards it's kind of just a volatile market in that it, like any sort of like just anything in the economy, like there's highs and there's lows, right? And it's all kind of influenced on like their various variables.
Right.
Multiple variables. I
Right.
think these various variables.
And
But I think some states are a little more stable than others. Right? It's,
States is in the 50 states.
Yeah, of the market, not
Not the, right, sometimes, and right, and would you like to see more stability, or do you think that's just a factor in it's inherent and it's tolerable?
I mean, stability is nice.
Yeah.
Right. Some people, like I know a lot of people who couldn't buy homes until the market crashed, right?
Yeah.
So there's like that. So
Right.
there's like plus sides, but also if the market goes up, you can't buy anything. But then those who have homes like gain more equity. So it's like I think it's
Right, it's interesting, there's a yin and yang to these
Yeah.
swings, that there's something to, there may be some gains to be made when it feels great. Anyone else? Thank you. Should have asked your name.
Marquise.
Marquise. All right. I have 13 minutes remaining. I'm halfway. So just a model of feminist theory. It starts with the assumption and the understanding that systems and structures of power and oppression exist. It accepts that, and how this works against difference by identity, sex, gender, race, ability, etc. This is how we get discrimination and exclusion. But through power, through action and knowledge, I would call not knowledge, action, power and oppression are acknowledged and disrupted, and this supports more understanding, advocacy, and change. Okay, so returning to our alternative housing sites, the research questions I have are, what are some of the lived experiences in various alternative housing schemes? To what degree are these sites for, as I keep talking about, individual or group liberation, justice, and equality? And what are some barriers to replication and scale? And what would it take to empower more people to surmount them? And here are my cases. I have a community land trust that's a rental on the top, a limited equity cooperative, community land trust manufactured homes, an intentional community, sometimes they're also thought of as communes, and a squat. And I also have one counter case, which is a gated community, and within it, another gate, so a double gated community, to just try to have some comparison with how lives might be lived in another way. And the criteria for selecting these cases that I have is that they had to be urban, in an urban environment. They had to be long-standing. They can't be something that's only been around for a couple of years, some sort of proof of concept, and they had to be relatively large. So not just a couple families, but something larger than that. And then my method is participant observation, going to these sites, trying to understand the lived experience from that perspective, interviewing folks, and content. These are some formative figures in women, formative female figures who historically have been very active in these movements and trying to create alternatives to what is typically done in these 140 plus million housing units in the United States, which is renting from a landlord or purchasing in the private market. Okay, so this is Marie Cirillo. She was a nun. She gave up the habit to move to Appalachia to advocate in Roses Creek for the residents there whose lives were very much devastated by mining. She formed one of the first community land trusts, the Woodland Community Land Trust in that area. She's still alive, she's 92. And then zooming to the present, can't resist more gazing at Dudley. This is Dudley Village. It is the rental units that sit on the Dudley Neighborhood Initiative Land Trust in Dorchester. And this is built in 2008. And it's 50 units, 50 rental units. And we'll talk about a little bit more after I introduce. The next case are resident-owned communities. This is Ruth Taylor. She was a Renaissance woman. She was a photographer, a preservationist, a realtor, and an advocate for the building resident-owned communities of manufactured homes. She bought a parcel off of Pacific 1, right by the Hearst Castle in California. She wanted to develop, I think, luxury mobile homes She was told no again and again. She took it to court after court after court. Ultimately, she persevered. The sentence that attracted me to her is, it said in the article, it took a lady to upset the apple cart. I don't think that she ever actually built her housing, but she did pave the way for many other resident-owned manufactured home communities like this one, Pasadena Trails in Houston, Texas. This is a resident-owned community. It's an organization that helps hundreds of households buy the land from their landowners when they're manufactured homes. And this particular one has a woman-only board. It's been around since 2012. And part of the transfer from private ownership to a manufactured home is that the ROC helps them with some infrastructure work. And so there was a devastating hurricane in Houston, and they distinguished themselves. They were not barely affected by it, and they were actually able to offer their neighbors some TA on how to shore up their developments. Next case are limited equity cooperatives. This is Esther Siegel, one Christmas Eve in 1978, the mean landlord knocks on her and her neighbor's door and says, "You're going to be evicted. I want this for a different purpose." She organized with the neighbors. They got educated on the law. They worked with a clever lawyer that figured out that they could have a first right of refusal. And so that began the transference. And in DC, there are limited equity cooperatives relative to the rest of the nation fairly common, because there's a lot of knowledge about how to take this right of first refusal and help residents convert it into limited equity cooperatives. My limited equity cooperative is in the US Virgin Islands. It will not be bad to visit there. In the 90s, HUD tried to decommission public housing and sell it back to the residents. This experiment, they tried to do a series of limited equity cooperatives. And this one, Pearson Garden, is the only surviving limited equity cooperative from that time. It is a fascinating place. It has many people in the arts and letters and the sports have come out of Pearson Gardens. This is Tony the Hawk. He's a boxer. He's in the US Boxing Hall of Fame. There's poets, rappers, academics. It's a fascinating place. Next are intentional living. This is Phoebe Lane. She lived in a Shaker village in New York. She lived there with her father. Her father decided that he wanted to leave the Shaker village. She did not. He tried to claim that he was her property. She said, no way. She also took it to court, and she ultimately persevered and was able to live out the rest of her life in the Shaker community. My community is Gonis in Staten Island. It's been around since 1980. It started out, no doubt, as a cultish commune, but I have a blog entry on that. From cult to community, Gonis mellows out with age. It is now a place where there's some people there that are quite serious about the tenants that started it, and then other people who just kind of live there affordably and peacefully. This is May Boron. She moved to Hawaii. She's an English woman. She moved to Hawaii, and she helped folks in Honolulu convert their native land into a homestead. And much more recently, this is Moms for Housing. They squatted in this abandoned home that was owned by a corporate entity. They squatted there. They got really active. They got a lot of attention. They prevailed. So what happens with squats is they never stay squats if they ultimately become permanent housing. This one will be a community land trust. All right, and then we have a gated community. Does anybody recognize this? How many planners do we have here? Oops. Give it away. No one, you're raising your hand. You recognize it? Okay. All right. This is one of the first gated communities in the United States. It started in the 1850s. It's called Llewellyn Park. There's a fellow on that called Llewellyn there. I wanted to let you know, here you are. And it started as a utopian community. It kind of changed identity. It's had 150 homes. It sort of changed identity over the years. As I mentioned, it's now a double gated community. Thomas Edison lived there for most of his life. Whoopi Goldberg lives there now. And Betty Berry was extremely active in the civic life of Llewellyn Park and the Ladies Association. And she also, very familiar to urban planners, she successfully fought a highway running through Llewellyn Park. So, okay, back to our research questions. What are some of the lived experiences? To what degree are these sites for individual or group liberation? And what are some barriers to replication? And what would it take to empower more people to think about doing something like this? I have some thoughts. They're preliminary. Lived experiences. So these housing environments house everybody. From students to seniors, from people of all walks of life. It's a huge variety of people that live there. And in terms of involvement, as I mentioned, this community land trust in Boston, it's rental. Many of the folks don't even know they live in a community land trust. So it can be from extremely low involvement to extremely high involvement. Donna, as I said before, each morning begins with a 2-hour session, a planning session for the rest of the day. So that's a lot of involvement. And then from short to long tenure, as you might guess, if you're a student, you're not going to live in these places very long. Some people spend their entire lives in these environments. For a community land trust, I think somebody should just study, and the average amount of time people live there is 6 or 7 years. Okay, are these sites for liberation, justice, and equality? I think the story of Phoebe Lane is an interesting one. Through living in the Shaker village, she was able to secure her liberation from her father. So I think that's important. Moms for Housing is a very active social justice movement. Just yesterday, they were on Facebook Live. I got a notification fighting an eviction. They are a very robust and out there group of people trying to fight for people's rights. And in general, I think these sites represent in some way the right to the city. This is a way for people to live in the city that otherwise may not be able to afford it or manage it. And what are the barriers to replication and empowerment? So I think there's a psychological barrier, which I'm trying to tribute against, which is helping people gain what I call a houser's imagination. So imagine yourself living in this place. Can you think about this as a place that you might want to live? So sort of demystifying what in the heck is going on there. And the physical barrier is land acquisition. Land is very expensive. It's especially expensive in cities, which are the most desirable places. And foundations, large, deep-pocketed foundations, are starting to realize that this is a place that they can support, get housing in perpetuity, get their name on housing in perpetuity. The Zuckerberg Foundation has started helping to facilitate the purchase of housing in the Bay Area. And actually all the big tech companies have pledged billions of dollars to trying to get some permanently affordable housing. And that is it in less than half an hour, because I didn't get another yellow notice. So I'm sorry, I'll talk very fast.
Okay, well, great. Well, so I'd like to open up time for Q&A. I will start with the in-person group. And then I know there's 39 comments online, so we'll get you online. Let's just start with folks in here. Anyone have any question or comment for Erin?
Yes.
Well, I know you just mentioned the tech, like they're pledging $billions for affordable housing. Like, I guess my very the question is just do you buy it? Like, is it a real effort? And if you see a influx of money into these methods,
right,
they deserve their goal.
Right. So I think in the tech one, right, it's very interesting to see how, right, the enormous pledges, right? So there's question one, it's fine, it's great to pledge, but does the money actually ever get dispersed? And that's where it gets really complicated. And I know Justin is teaching a class, or last semester maybe taught a class on real estate development. And so getting that deal together, even if these actors are completely earnest, getting the deal together is very, very complicated. So their first acquisition, which was in East Palo Alto, the Facebook one, I mean, you can't even find Facebook and really in the list of who owns it, who's supported, because it's so complex trying to get, all the pieces together. So it's sort of it's both that it's maybe they're not being that genuine, but also it's not as easy as like the way a museum used to be, and a foundation would just say there's going to be a museum in my name, and there it was. So it's definitely much more complicated than other gifts in the past.
Sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
could you repeat the question so people can hear?
Okay.
Yeah.
For me?
I think next question.
Yeah, next
Okay.
Yeah. His question was, how realistic do we think it is that Facebook is actually going to follow with their pledge for permanently affordable housing? Especially, I'll just add this, and I'll guess you're saying deeply affordable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions at this point?
What's the physical barriers? Like, I know land acquisitions is a big one, but were there other physical barriers that were sort of common across all of these different kinds of housing? I don't know, in terms of like funding for building structure or like. improvement.
That's, yeah, thank you for asking that. I haven't been to the sites yet for the most part. So I'm absolutely going to be thinking about that because I think that is a very insightful question. Is right beyond just the land, right? What are the, and that I think is one of the things back to the housing's imagination, like how much work is this really taking? Because I could just rent an apartment and be done with it, you know? So thank you.
Well, I mean, apartments are expensive, but I think most of you have a pretty good idea of what a typical apartment costs in the greater Boston area, outside of, you know, these alternatives. So I think it may be helpful, Erin, if you talk a little bit about the scale of affordability. I know someone lives in a commune, 3 rooms and food, $400 a month. So maybe just talk about like how all these different levels kind of compare.
Right. So, okay. So so it's sort of interesting. People don't exactly want to talk about this. So, you know, but for Ghana's, because I asked the student who lived there, because you can ask students things like this because they're more forthcoming. So he said, I think it was $1,400 a month all in. That was what it cost him to live there. And he was comparing it to had left a dorm of a nearby university. And I think it was sort of double that. So for him,
New York City.
well, in Staten Island. Yeah. Right. And so for him, it was, you know, very, very tempting. I mean, I calculated it, and if he just saved the difference at the end of his college years, he would have saved like $25,000, and then he could just have a down payment, and then he'd go back into home ownership. And for limited equity cooperatives, I mean, again, it really varies depending on the urban environment, but they usually around like $1,200 to $1,000 to $1,500 a month. I mean, that's but they're, or maybe half what you might expect from market rate.
And with the manufactured housing, what is that?
Manufactured housing is, thank you for asking. So manufactured housing, the savings it's complicated. So the savings is that, so you used to rent the land from these, you know, sort of avaricious or not that competent landlords. There's sort of either landlords that were kind of greedy or landlords that couldn't quite maintain the property. And so you would have the rent, and then you have the manufactured home that you own. And those, it's hard to say, but they may cost between $20,000 and $50,000. And I would say like manufactured homeowners are actually only like true homeowners, because that's all they own. They just own they don't own the land. They own the structure. However, I hope I can say, I try to explain this. I'm not great at explaining this. When you have a budget on a manufactured home, and you're getting into the market, you don't really care. You have $1,000 budget. You don't really care. If 3/4 of the costs are coming and renting the land, then the house is suddenly worth a lot less. So what these resident communities can do is reduce the cost of the land so that the cost of the structure raises, so that it actually increases the equity for the manufactured homeowners. You're nodding, so maybe I did it right this time. I've tried to explain like 4 or 5 times and I'm not good at it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for during the initial stages of this really interesting project, and also the way you framed the concerns that these are addressing.
Yeah.
And I particularly appreciated your approach to capitalism. And I'm wondering what would happen if you layered onto your framings an understanding of affordability that also encompasses the challenge of where do people's income comes from, whether it's wages or other sources, which could be government or the rest of us as we're exploited in the capitalist economy. And part of that aspect of the other costs that go into affordability are also the work of caring that is often unpaid, or if it is paid, it's another burden of us, and also location costs. So where are we in our manufactured housing, for example, in relation to where we need to go to live out our lives and have our employment or do our caring? So I'm curious about how that thinking might be adjacent to or incorporated into the project.
So I'm listening to you and trying to figure out how to translate that for the online audience.
Sorry.
Woo. Can we say it one more time and we'll try to, yeah.
What happens when we think about affordability?
Yeah.
In a broader,
Right.
in a broader realm,
Yeah.
to include income
Right,
and care work.
right. Well, I think those are super fascinating things to think about. I think the constraint on these environments is that ultimately they are run on a budget, and it's not, the money is generated from the, from the people that live there. So I don't know if they can, in the way that a public system, could accommodate care work in some way, and you could get some sort of credit if you engaged in care work. But since these are outside, they're outside both capitalism, but they're also outside both the subsidy system. Right now, in the moment, I can't think of how to think about how people have to put their lives together in order to get by. Is that I'm punting on you?
So why don't we take a question from online, and there are at this point 49.
All right.
Well, some are comments and some are short essays. Why don't we just start with this one? So the whole concept comes from the civil rights movement. How is this now a feminist movement?
It's not now a feminist movement. It's a lens. So one of the ways that we can look back on different efforts is to say, okay, and we evaluate them is how do we evaluate them under a new set of ideals or norms? So another way to evaluate them is in terms of do they advance the principles of social justice? So I'm sorry if I suggested in any way that this was commandeered by feminism. It's more that it's a new way to look at a problem that might unearth new and hopefully interesting and helpful observations.
Could you share any details from your research about how these alternative housing structures support seniors and opportunities to age in place or age in community?
A friend was just asking me that the other day. And I agree, this is a major issue as we an aging population. And other than many people who live there do feel comfortable to live out their days, and they can live there affordably. They've been ideally able to set aside some savings through the affordability, but I agree it's a huge area of need and thought and reflection.
Thank you. Why don't we bring it back to the room? Does anyone else have anything they want to ask about or talk through? I have one over here. Nascent projects can we follow? What would you recommend we kind of pay attention to that are kind of going on now, that are getting started, and maybe even support if we believe in them?
Interesting. Well, you can always follow Moms for Housing. They're very active. And nascent projects. Other than that's the only nascent project but I'll think about it. Get back to you, internet.
Yeah, no, I mean, there have been a lot of these, you've talked about these ones that have been around for a while, and
Right.
for research purposes, that's really helpful to ones
Right.
that are more established.
Right.
Got another one, just curious why social housing doesn't seem to play a role as an alternative in your work. Seems like there are some great examples of successful social housing. Vienna's, for
Right.
example.
Right. So I think, well, I meant to say this, and I actually spoke too quickly, it turned out. I had more time than I thought. But many of these housing types in some form or another are pretty common in Europe, which is also is basically a capitalist system. So once again, these things can thrive. The reason that I'm focused on these outside of social housing is because on some level, I think they're agovernmental, which can be useful during political regimes that are more exclusive. So one of the really hard things about American public housing during immigration is there's a great deal of fear among folks who live there whose status is unclear, and they may feel unwelcome. They also sometimes don't even apply because they're afraid of participating. So it's sometimes useful to stand outside those systems when those systems are not working for everybody.
Yeah, and at least in the United States, public housing has a very strong stigma. And
Right.
so, that's in terms of government support, popular support for it, where, I know a lot of the UEP grad students that I talk to, people are really enthusiastic about a lot of these models. But I don't get too many students who come up to me and say, let's invest more in building more public housing. So
I'm not against that either.
Yeah,
I mean, we were talking, Laura and I were talking the other day. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, I mean, right, there were millions of public housing units that were built, and that is, and we were saying that's not even scale. That didn't even solve the problem, but it was a heck of a lot more that was produced now. Well, now we're decommissioning public housing. So I think it's also, as I said, it's also about choice. It's about that as people think about their housing tenure, that's where you're going to live across your lifetime. Maybe you'll rent sometime. Maybe you'll live in social housing. Maybe you'll live in alternative housing. Maybe you'll own. Maybe you'll go back. Maybe you'll live in a retirement community. But that we have this stylized notion of an American housing career, which is you start as a renter and you end as a homeowner. And so it's just, maybe there's some other options in there for you somewhere to do something different with your time. I think home ownership is oppressive because you have to spend a lot of time thinking about your investment, maintaining your investment. It makes you not necessarily the nicest neighbor. And so, being relieved of the anxiety of, I read it today, our housing value is going down in Boston in 2023, so there are downsides to the system that maybe you just want to step out for a minute.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'll come to you, Patrick, in a sec, but like this idea that like NIMBY, not in my backyard, is a phenomena that we talk about a lot, but you're suggesting that reimagining housing through these alternative models, it eliminates that,
Right.
and on some level it eliminates it. And then my other comment is you're right, people move all the time. I don't know about you guys. Who in the last 5 years has moved more than 3 times? That's almost everybody in the room. Okay.
Right. Well, you're in this audience.
People move all the time, and so we don't always have to be moving to the same kind of housing, right? So I think that's what's really valuable about this research. Patrick had his hand up.
Yeah, thanks for all this. I have a question around, it's somewhat related around the government program, the government support.
Patrick is asking about some combining these efforts to see if we can get some sort of stronger cross-fertilization across these different schemes, from government subsidies to alternative housing. So at first, when you were talking about, I don't know of any, but then I think on the land side, just pure land acquisition, I think you see quite a bit of government land being handed over to community land trusts or being sold to community land trusts at highly affordable rates. So I think in that case, but I think it's exciting to think about both, like, wait, there could be a lot of great work that could be done if you could use some government funds to support these. And then I don't know of any beyond this land thing. And that makes me wonder why. And I'm guessing there is some sort of barrier to that either is a barrier of the houser's imagination or something more fiduciary that is harder to cross. But that I'm going to keep thinking about that. Thank you.
So as you think about maybe the last time you were thinking about changing places, what about if any of these models came up? Do you think that you'd be interested?
Has anyone ever lived in a housing co-op? I lived in a housing co-op in college. Yeah. It was great. Yeah. What was it called? Okay, just the address. Yeah, I bet there's a few co-ops in Ithaca, student co-ops. Anyone else? Yeah, so I lived in a few student co-ops. I lived in mixed income housing, but I lived in public housing. But as I betrayed I ultimately on my housing career did become a homeowner. So I'm not walking the total walk. People who squat, and squatting is a very serious community. It's a very, people are really dedicated to that in a way that is impressive in how and the conditions they'll endure to live the lives that they think are important to live. Any more questions?
So I think we have time for maybe just one more question. What does it mean? This is a plan that will open up more challenges and people might be victimized. How do you protect vulnerable residents in some of these situations?
Oh, it's rushing too quickly. So, right, I agree completely. There is a lot of vulnerability. The Moms for Housing had multiple encounters with the police and fully armored police. So this is not necessarily work when you advocate for it. That's for the fan part. When we're talking about property in America, we're probably talking about guns. So how to keep people safe is that's an ongoing question. I think I will be thinking about that. I think life in these places, once they're established, and again, I am selecting examples of established places, so I may not run into some of these, situations where people feel put at risk. But I think there is some risk involved anytime you do something that's outside the norm.
And I know there's a lot more comments online, and I really appreciate people contributing to the conversation. Erin is going to be here the rest of the
Right.
semester, all the way through May, as a visiting
Right.
scholar. So
Visit me.
she's visiting, you visit her, and she's gonna be visiting a few classes, doing some lectures. So yeah, I mean, definitely connect. And so why don't we do a applause? Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.